Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a big one. How do people actually form political opinions?
Classic question.
Right. And we've got three sources this time around to really get into it. We've got Robert Kurzban's The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind, Pinker's Enlightenment Now,
A great one.
and then this summary comparison that actually brings in Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, too. So it's kind of a Pinker versus Kurzban face-off in a way.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how those viewpoints line up.
Or don't. Exactly. So have you ever wondered why you believe what you believe politically?
It's a question I think we all wrestle with.
Is it really about logic? Or is something else going on under the surface?
Well, Kurzban would probably say logic isn't always the main driver.
Okay, so let's start there. Kurzban's book dives into this whole idea of self-interest being at the heart of our political beliefs.
Right. Yeah, he really challenges this notion that we're all walking around with these perfectly consistent ideologies. Like fitting neatly into liberal or conservative boxes.
Which, let's be honest, most of us probably like to think we do.
Right. We like to think we're consistent and principled, but Kurzban argues that our beliefs are often a lot more fluid and self-serving than we'd like to admit.
So we might say we believe in something, but our actual choices tell a different story.
Exactly. He uses this great example of conflicting views on same-sex marriage and income redistribution.
Okay, so someone might be totally liberal on same-sex marriage, but then surprisingly conservative when it comes to raising taxes to fund social programs.
Exactly. And this is where his concept of Jerpy syndrome comes in.
Jerpy syndrome. That doesn't sound good.
Haha, no! It stands for deeply erroneous, redundant, and predictable. Basically, the idea is that sometimes our deeply held values are really just fancy ways of saying, I like what I like.
So kind of like how some people are diehard fans of a sports team even if they haven't won a game in years?
Perfect analogy. They come up with all sorts of justifications, but ultimately it boils down to, I just like this team.
So Kurzban's saying we do the same thing with political beliefs. We dress up our self-interest in fancier language.
Exactly. And he argues this D-sharp-P syndrome can actually prevent us from really understanding the roots of our political beliefs.
Because we're not being honest with ourselves about why we believe what we believe?
Right. We might cloak it in the language of ideology, but ultimately it's often about what benefits the groups we identify with.
And this is where inclusive interests comes in, right? This idea that self-interest goes beyond just our own personal gain.
Exactly. It includes the well-being of our family, our community, even our social class or racial group. Kurzban argues that a lot of our political choices are driven by this broader sense of self-interest.
So it's not just about, will this policy put more money in my pocket? It's also about, will it help my kids get into a good college? Or will it protect my community from crime?
Precisely. And that's where things can get really complex because different groups can have very different inclusive interests, leading to clashes over policies that might seem straightforward on the surface.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this plays out in the real world. Now, where does Pinker fit into all of this? His book, Enlightenment, now seems to be coming from a very different place.
It does. While Kurzban is focused on this often hidden self-interest driving our choices, Pinker takes a much more optimistic view.
He's all about progress. So.
Exactly. Pinker argues that despite all the negativity we see in the news, the world has actually gotten objectively better in countless ways.
Like, give me some examples, because I think we could all use a dose of optimism right now.
Well, for starters, lifespans have increased dramatically over the past century. Child mortality has plummeted. Extreme poverty has been drastically reduced. Those are just a few.
Okay, those are pretty big ones. But surely Pinker acknowledges that we still have a lot of problems, right? Inequality, climate change, political polarization.
Of course, he doesn't deny those exist. But he argues that our focus on the negative, what he calls the bad news bias, can actually prevent us from appreciating the incredible progress that has been made.
So it's not about ignoring the bad stuff, but about putting it in context.
Exactly. And in Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker makes a similar argument about violence. He presents a ton of evidence showing that violence has actually been declining throughout human history, even though it might not feel that way when we watch the news.
So both in terms of overall well-being and high violence. Pinker's saying, hey, things are actually getting better, even if it doesn't always seem like it.
Right. And this is where we start to see a potential clash with Kurzban's more cynical view of human nature. Kurzban might argue that even those positive trends are ultimately driven by self-interest.
So, for example, Maybe violence has declined because we've developed systems and institutions that make it less beneficial to be violent.
Exactly. It's not necessarily that we've become more altruistic or peaceful as a species. It's that violence, in many cases, is no longer the most effective way to achieve our goals.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. We've got these two very different perspectives. Pinker, the optimist, seeing progress driven by reason and enlightenment values, and Kurzban, the pragmatist, arguing that even our best behaviors are often rooted in self-interest.
It's a fascinating tension, and it raises some big questions about human progress and the role of self-interest in shaping our political choices. What stands out to you so far?
That's a great question for our listeners to think about. We'll be back in just a bit to dive deeper into how these ideas play out in the real world of politics. So before the break, we were talking about Steven Pinker and Robert Kurzban and their contrasting views, Pinker being all about progress and Kurzban being a bit more grounded maybe about how self-interest shapes our political choices.
Yeah, and this difference in perspective really comes up when we look at political ideology.
Okay, so how does Kurzban explain those conflicting views we see within people's own beliefs? Like the example we talked about, someone being super liberal on same-sex marriage, but then against wealth redistribution.
Right. Well, he argues that our beliefs aren't necessarily driven by some grand overarching ideology, but by a collection of more specific preferences, often rooted in our lifestyle and the groups we belong to.
So it's less about liberal versus conservative in some abstract sense, and more about what policies benefit me and the people I care about.
Exactly. And this is where his ideas about freewheelers and ring bearers come in.
Okay, those terms. Give me a refresher. Who are these people?
So freewheelers are generally more socially liberal. They tend to be less religious, more open to things like casual sex, less tied to traditional family structures.
So folks who are kind of freewheeling through life, not as bound by tradition.
Right. And then you have the ring bearers who are more socially conservative. They value monogamy, marriage, often have larger families.
The ring symbolizing commitment and tradition. I get it. But how do these lifestyle preferences connect to political beliefs?
Kurzban argues they influence our views on a whole range of issues. Abortion, same-sex marriage, drug policy, even things like environmental regulations.
So a freewheeler might be more likely to support policies that emphasize individual freedom and choice, while a ring bearer might prioritize policies that support traditional family values and social stability.
Exactly. And this is where you see Kurzban's focus on self-interest coming in. He's arguing that our political choices are often driven by these deeply personal, even subconscious, desires to protect our own way of life. The values we hold dear.
It's like I want policies that create a world where my lifestyle is supported and affirmed.
Right. And how does Pinker explain these different viewpoints? He doesn't seem to dwell as much on self-interest, does he?
Not really. So what's his take?
Pinker might acknowledge that these lifestyle preferences exist, but he'd likely argue that we shouldn't just accept them as fixed and unchanging. Remember, he's all about reason and dialogue.
So instead of digging our heels in and defending our own little tribes, we should talk to each other, understand each other's perspectives, and see if we can find some common ground.
Exactly. Pinker might even point to the progress we've made on issues like LGBTQ rights as evidence that reason and empathy can win out, even when people have deeply ingrained differences.
Okay, so Kurzban's saying, hey, acknowledge those self-interested motivations. And Pinker's saying, don't underestimate the power of reason. It's interesting to think about which perspective is more accurate. Or maybe it's a bit of both.
Probably a bit of both. And this tension between self-interest and reason plays out not just at the individual level, but also when we look at how Kurzban and Pinker view political coalitions.
Right, we haven't even touched on that. Kurzban gets pretty specific about how he sees the Republican and Democratic coalitions, right?
He does. He uses these really vivid analogies. For example, he describes the Republican Party as a tree.
Okay, a tree. What kind of tree are we talking about here?
He puts the John Boners at the core. Think wealthy religious conservatives. They're the trunk.
Solid traditional.
Yeah.
I can see that. So who makes up the branches?
Branching out from the Boners, you've got the Johnsons and the church ladies.
Okay, starting to sound like a family reunion. Tell me more.
So the Johnsons are your libertarian-leaning Republicans, all about fiscal conservatism, smaller government, lower taxes, less concerned with social issues, more focused on individual liberty and free markets.
So freewheelers of the Republican Party in a way.
You could say that. Then you have the church ladies, your staunch social conservatives, deeply invested in issues like abortion, traditional family values, religious freedom. Might be less focused on economic policy, but very active when it comes to those culture war issues.
Two very different branches of the Republican tree, each with their own priorities.
Yeah.
What about the Democrats? What analogy does Kurzban use for them?
He sees the Democratic coalition as a bit more diverse. Less like a tree and more like well, let's just say a bustling city with lots of different neighborhoods.
Okay, I'm picturing a city with a vibrant mix of people and ideas, which I guess fits the Democratic Party's image.
He identifies a core group of African-American voters, then a strong contingent of highly educated liberals. He calls them the Barney Steinums.
Ah, the Barney Steinums representing that progressive intellectual wing of the party.
Exactly. And then he throws in this interesting group he calls the Springers.
The Springers.
Hmm?
Wait, as in Jerry Springer. I'm not sure I want to picture that neighborhood.
It's a provocative label, for sure. He uses it to describe people who are socially conservative but economically liberal.
Okay, that's a fascinating mix. I can see why he chose that label. Definitely reflects some of the, shall we say, unconventional views you might see on that show. But it also highlights how these political coalitions aren't always as clear-cut as they seem.
Absolutely. You've got people within the same party who might agree on some issues but vehemently disagree on others.
So even within those tribes that Kurzban describes, there's a lot of nuance and complexity.
Right. And this is where, again, Pinker might offer a more optimistic take. He might see this diversity within coalitions as a potential strength. Maybe it's not about forcing everyone to conform to a rigid ideology, but rather about finding ways to work together despite our differences.
So focusing on those shared goals, those areas where our interests align, even if our underlying motivations aren't exactly the same.
Exactly. And that's a good segue into the last part of our deep dive, where we explore, where we go from here. Can we bridge these political divides? Is there hope for a more reasoned, less self-interested approach to politics?
Big questions for sure. We'll be right back to tackle those after a quick break. Okay, so we're back, and we've spent this deep dive looking at these two contrasting perspectives. Kurzban's focus on self-interest, and Pinker's emphasis on reason and progress. So where do we go from here? Can we actually bridge these political divides that seem to be pulling us apart?
Well, neither Kurzban nor Pinker offers a simple solution, but they give us some really valuable tools for understanding the problem, which is always the first step.
Okay, so let's start with Kurzban. If he's right, and a lot of our political behavior is driven by this hidden self-interest, doesn't that make it pretty hard to find common ground?
It definitely makes it more challenging. But remember, Kurzban isn't saying people are inherently selfish or greedy. It's more about recognizing that we're all motivated at some level by a desire to protect ourselves and the people we care about.
Right? Those inclusive interests. Our families, our communities, our social groups.
Exactly. We want policies that create a world where those groups can thrive. And understanding those underlying motivations can help us have more empathy for people who hold different views.
Instead of just assuming the other side is evil or stupid.
Right. Maybe they're not being stubborn or irrational. Maybe they're genuinely afraid that certain policies will harm their families or communities.
So we can try to understand the real-life concerns that are shaping their outlook.
Exactly. And that can open up space for more productive conversations. Instead of just yelling at each other about abstract principles, we can start talking about how specific policies will actually impact real people.
It's about moving beyond those labels and actually listening to each other's stories.
Right. Now, Pinker might add to this by reminding us of the power of reason and dialogue, He'd probably say that even if our initial motivations are rooted in self-interest, we can still use our capacity for reason to find solutions that benefit everyone.
So it's like, okay, we all have our own interests. Let's be smart about this. Let's find ways to compromise, to create policies that address those interests in a way that's fair and sustainable for everyone.
Exactly. And Pinker might point to examples like the decline of violence or the progress we've made on poverty as evidence that reason and cooperation can lead to positive change.
Like, look, we've done it before. We've faced big challenges and found ways to overcome them. Not by ignoring our differences, but by working together.
Exactly. And both Kurzban and Pinker might agree that a key part of this process is being more aware of our own biases and motivations. Remember Kurzban's analogy of the mind as a corporation?
Yeah, with that public relations department in our heads spinning narratives to justify our self-interests.
Right. So maybe the first step is to be a bit more skeptical of our own internal PR departments, to ask ourselves, why do I believe this so strongly? Is it really based on logic and evidence? Or am I just protecting my own tribe?
That's a tough question to ask ourselves.
It is, but it's crucial if we want to have more honest and productive conversations.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the depths of self-interest to the heights of human progress.
It's been a fascinating journey.
And I think the key takeaway is that understanding political minds is an ongoing process. But by engaging with these different perspectives, by being curious about our own motivations, and more willing to listen to those who see things differently, we can at least start to move in the right direction. So until next time, keep those minds open and those conversations flowing.